In the 20th century, in the year 1917, the atmosphere at sea was becoming increasingly tense and mysterious. In the dark, tar-like waters, which seemed almost black, dangers lurked, and thick fog, like a cloud of smoke, gathered over the waves, making them even more ominous and unpredictable. In such an environment, the ship's commander, a crew member named Daniel David Lumis, could not shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone was observing every move he made. His vessel, the ship called Fanning, was plowing through the Atlantic Ocean, feeling like a foreign and hostile space. America had just entered the war, and these waters were under the control of the Kaiser, along with his invisible hunters, submarines hidden in the depths, ready to appear suddenly. At that moment, suddenly, his gaze caught a small movement on the water's surface. He noticed a barely perceptible ripple, almost indistinguishable on the waves. At first, he thought it was just hair on the lens or a random reflection of light. But then the movement repeated itself. A thin, almost invisible streak appeared on the surface, slowly rising from the depths and bending over the waves. At that moment, Lumis shouted, "Periscope!" and his heart beat faster. Such moments became a true nightmare for every sailor. When an enemy periscope appeared at the surface, it was to be expected. A torpedo would follow soon. An alarm bell rang out, and sailors hurriedly walked along the deck. The ship's crew was brought to battle readiness with depth charges. For the first time during the entire war, an American ship had spotted an enemy hunter before it could strike. By the end of 1916, during the last months of this difficult and bloody period, Germany was in a complex situation. While the war on the Western Front had reached a deadlock, and both sides were locked in endless confrontation, Berlin's leadership understood. Traditional warfare was no longer yielding the desired results. Their secret weapon was submarines, stubborn, stealthy, and very dangerous. These submarines had already caused significant destruction, destroying a large portion of Allied cargo and ships. But despite these successes, vital trade routes of Britain remained open, allowing the country to continue the war. Without decisive action, Germany had very little time left to achieve victory. German Supreme Commander, General Admiral Henning von Holzendorf, decided to act decisively. He prepared a secret message, which on December 22, 1916, he delivered to Kaiser Wilhelm II and Colonel Hindenburg. In it, he proposed abandoning the rules of war that had existed until then, the so-called prize rules, and establishing unrestricted submarine warfare. His plan was to sink all enemy ships heading to Britain without warning, disregarding rescue vessels and lifeboats. The idea was to destroy about 600,000 registered tons of cargo ships within 4 to 5 months, just enough, according to calculations, to reduce British supplies by approximately 40% and force the country to surrender from hunger and exhaustion. Holzendorf acknowledged that American involvement in the war was inevitable, but he was confident in the success of his plan. He explicitly stated, and this was important, that no American would land on the continent. He hoped to deliver a swift and deadly blow to end the war before American troops arrived, which could alter the course of events. Pressure in Berlin was intensifying. Chancellor Bettmann Gollweg warned that such a policy could draw America into the war and lead to economic retaliation. But Count Gennings von Holzendorf, at the beginning of the 20th century, amid fierce struggles for control over maritime routes, faced a real danger that a small island could be completely destroyed before reinforcements from the United States arrived. This threat became especially acute at a time when the Allied powers, Britain and its allies, were struggling to respond effectively to the rapidly changing situation. Early in the war, when it came to cargo delivery and replenishment, convoys were rejected as unprofitable and too slow. The British Admiralty stubbornly refused to entrust the protection of merchant ships to joint forces, believing that grouping ships with their escorts would only slow down deliveries and make the vessels more vulnerable to attacks. As a result, the initial attempts to organize protected convoys were rejected, and maritime transport continued along the old pattern, ships sailing alone, risking easy prey for German U-boats. However, the situation gradually changed when the scale of losses reached a critical point. Monthly ship losses exceeded 300,000 gross tons of cargo. At that point, in closed cabinet meetings, Naval command and military experts began actively fighting for immediate changes in tactics. Meanwhile, Germany was advancing rapidly, not sparing effort or resources. By February 1st, more than 100 submarines were operating in waters leading to vital trade routes, accelerating patrols and creating a threat to all maritime commerce. Their commanders were in a state of high combat readiness, prepared for any surprise. German naval strategist Admiral Holzendorf remained confident in his strength, despite growing intelligence confirming that America had begun preparing its convoy transports and was expanding its Atlantic fleet. Part 3 of 9. If the German submarine campaign had been able to completely destroy the British merchant fleet by the summer months, and that would have meant the end of Britain's hopes for survival, Germany could have declared victory in the war. But if the strategy failed, Germany risked opening a new front, where fresh American forces, weapons, and supplies would come to aid the British and French ships. Despite all Germany's efforts, the Allies remained active. In the depths of the seas, behind closed doors in headquarters, active preparations were underway. The main directions included developing convoy tactics, conducting experiments with depth charges, and repositioning destroyers to new positions. All of this aimed to test and disprove the risky Holzendorf tactic. Soon, from the spring of 1917, a new phase of the struggle began, which could determine the outcome of the entire naval campaign. The crucial question was, could the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare destroy Britain, or would it backfire and become a catastrophe for Germany? Initially, the attack strategy proved successful. Soon, British grain supplies were reduced to a 6-week reserve. This meant that if the situation did not change, the country would face serious food shortages and risk falling into famine. In Berlin, officials confidently continued to insist on their blockade, believing that its disruption and pressure on the British economy would lead to the fall of the government by summer. Inside the country and within Britain itself, resistance to change was strong. The Admiralty, convinced that convoys would slow cargo delivery and make ships more vulnerable, stubbornly adhered to the old policy, the so-called every man for himself tactic. However, by the end of April 1917, the situation began to change. At this stage, Vice Admiral Alexander Duff, head of the submarine warfare section, persistently advised First Sea Lord John Jellicoe to reconsider the strategy. Airships and balloons began to be used for high-altitude reconnaissance. Despite the fact that only 43 destroyers had been prepared at that point, significantly fewer than the planned 75, their tactical value became immediately apparent. By the summer of 1917, this tactic was slowly but surely changing the course of naval warfare. Even though many ships had not yet joined the main group, each convoy formation received enhanced escort, which significantly reduced the threat from submarines. As a result, ship losses decreased markedly, and by July 1917, the tonnage lost in a month no longer reached the levels seen in April of the same year. Part 4 of 9. This pivotal moment created the conditions for American destroyers, such as USS Fanning and USS Nicholson, to shift from escort roles to active pursuit and destruction of submarines. The periscope's light barely touched the surface of the North Atlantic, a metallic finger cautiously piercing the gray water 7 miles south of Queenstown, Ireland. Through the narrow mirror, Lieutenant Commander Gustav Amberger watched the OQ-20 convoy emerge from the evening fog on November 17, 1917. For 2 days, he had been positioned near this route aboard the submarine U-58, moving quietly and silently, with his crew working smoothly and without noise. The vessel itself hovered in a state between surface and depth, like a predator 193 feet long, waiting for the right moment to strike. Amberger slowly rotated the periscope over the convoy formation, 8 merchant ships trying to stay in 4 columns, escorted by 6 American destroyers and 2 British corvettes. His target was already chosen: the Welshman, a steamer loading important supplies, with a tonnage of 5,782 tons. This low-bowed submerged vessel was an excellent target. Inside the cramped control room, the U-58 crew was already preparing a torpedo, performing their task with practiced coordination. 8 days had passed since Amberger's first patrol as commander. During this time, he had already sunk 1 British sailing ship, and now his target, Welshman, was to become his second victim. Over a year of service under his command, U-58 had destroyed 21 ships, It was a U-57 type submarine, commissioned on August 9, 1916, and launched in October of the same year as part of the Imperial German Navy's Second Flotilla. Its crew of 39 men had mastered the art of ambush, and Amberger intended to continue this tradition. 400 yards from the submarine, USS Fanning, with its narrow hull swaying on the waves, slowly rocked with each swell. This Paulding-class destroyer, displacing 742 tons, was launched in 1911 for other types of combat. However, after a quick modernization in Boston, it was fitted with depth charges. The so-called ash cans, drums containing 30 centners of TNT, which sailors called empty cans due to their clumsy appearance. Under Lieutenant Arthur Chips Carpenter, Fanning guarded the rear left flank of the convoy. Despite fatigue from months of constant patrols, the crew remained vigilant. The ship no longer looked young. Its depth charges sometimes detonated prematurely, causing damage and alarm among the crew. Part 5 of 9. In heavy sea conditions, the ship often listed and rolled, making navigation difficult. When the vessel named Fanning had narrow and capricious characteristics, its opponent, the ship called Nicholson, had a broader, more stable design. This ship was armed with 4 4-inch guns and torpedo tubes, clearly indicating its purpose for modern combat. While Fanning appeared more fragile and less stable, Nicholson was distinguished by reliability and power. At that time, the senior officer, Berrien, was present on board. He had already proven himself in battle by successfully repelling the German submarine number 62 in October. Although no one could confirm its sinking then, his decisiveness and fighting spirit were evident. The convoy, which included these ships, departed from Queenstown Port precisely at 11:45 a.m. It moved southward, slowly and cautiously, until it formed into entire columns to ensure safety and maneuverability. This entire process took several hours. Destroyers and their escort ships circled around like shepherds organizing their flock. During this time, the crews carefully monitored the situation, prepared for possible danger. By 4:10 p.m., when only 7 miles remained between them and safety, they were passing through increasingly dense fog, with visibility decreasing. The remnants of daylight disappeared, giving way to the approaching darkness. On the bridge of the Fanning, the helmsman's assistant, coxswain David Daniel Lumis, strained to rub his eyes to better see the horizon. His crewmates often spoke of his ability to see even in the most difficult conditions, noting with some admiration his unusual vision. One officer called them the most astonishing set of eyes. While most people could only see the gray water merging with the gray sky, Lumis noticed tiny details invisible to the ordinary eye. The fog grew thicker. Visibility decreased to a minimum of 400 meters, and even these boundaries seemed very tentative. Water splashed by wave fragments and drops mixed with the fog, creating a dense wall that seemed to swallow the ships ahead. Lumis methodically scanned the horizon, repeating this ritual thousands of times during his service in the convoy, constantly watching the situation. Suddenly, he noticed something unusual. It was not a trace line, but something else. On the water's surface, a thin, dark line about 1 to 2 inches in diameter stood out, protruding about 10 inches above the surface. The line remained motionless, as if frozen, which immediately alerted Lumis. He shouted with a cry, "Periscope!" His voice cut through the fog and echoed across the bridge. It was like a whip cracking in the silence. For a moment, everyone on the bridge froze. Then the ship's commander, Lieutenant Walter O. Henry, reacted instantly. His voice rang out decisively and clearly, "Hard to port, full speed ahead." At the same moment, he pressed the alarm button for general emergency, and the bow of the ship suddenly began turning sharply to the left. Bells rang throughout the vessel, and the crew, quickly realizing what was happening, rushed to their battle stations to prepare for a possible confrontation. Meanwhile, in the control room of the U-68 Amberger submarine, the officer was observing the approaching danger through the periscope. A destroyer appeared out of the fog, rapidly approaching with its bow aimed directly at the submarine. The vessel was moving very slowly to avoid revealing its presence, which caused U-58 to shudder sharply, as if struck by a giant hammer. Sparks flew from the electrical panels in the engine room, and the crackling sounds of short circuits filled the space. At that very moment, the aft diving planes, responsible for controlling depth, jammed and refused to respond to the crew's commands. High-pressure oil pipes burst, their jets spraying forcefully in all directions, splattering hot machinery and glowing parts. Soon, water began seeping through cracks in the hull because internal pressure had risen so high that it exceeded design limits. At such a moment, Commander Amberger ordered the submarine to dive deeper to escape the dangerous underwater charges that could destroy her in an instant. It was a desperate decision, as the maximum depth U-58 could reach was approximately 164 feet, and the submarine was already in a critical condition. The pressure gauge showed her sinking deeper and deeper, surpassing 150, 180, even 200 feet. And the dive continued. The jammed stern planes kept pulling the submarine downward, forcing it to submerge even further. The hull creaked and rang as if producing sounds no naval officer wanted to hear. These were the screams of steel as it tested its ultimate strength, protesting against the pressure. At a depth of 250 feet, the first signs of destruction appeared. Rivets began popping out of their holes, and jets of cold seawater struck the compartments with furious force, like fire hoses. Commander Amberger shouted, his voice filled with panic and determination. "Blow all ballast tanks! Surface! Surface now!" Several hundred yards away, Commander Berrien on his destroyer Nicholson watched Fanning's attack. Without waiting for orders or explanations, he quickly turned his ship toward the raging sea, where a deep charge explosion had occurred the day before, intending to drop his own bomb. As soon as Nicholson completed its turn, the sea erupted with a powerful wave, and suddenly the Lumis 58 tower rose from beneath the water, breaking the surface like a whale. Water streamed down the damaged hull, and the submarine flailed, unable to dive or escape. The explosion of Nicholson's depth charge was devastating. Lifting the bow of the submarine into the air, it caused the vessel to surface completely, then the hull collapsed back down. Inside the submarine, people were thrown by the force of the blast, their bodies hitting the bulkheads. Lamps shattered, and the remaining electrical systems instantly went dark. The destroyer crews, disbelief evident on their faces and unable to believe they actually had an enemy submarine in front of them, froze for a moment, stunned before opening fire. At that moment, both destroyers simultaneously began firing. From the Fanning's guns, a 3-inch cannon at the stern and a 4-inch gun on Nicholson's bow, shells flew through the air. Water jets erupted around the submarine as shells and cartridges found their targets. 3 salvos from each ship. Suddenly, people appeared on the deck of Lumis 58. Hatches were slammed open, and sailors ran out, raising their hands to show they surrendered. Some waved white flags, anything that could be interpreted as a sign of capitulation. The fire ceased. The battle lasted exactly 15 minutes. Fanning's cautiously approached, still at the ready. Some of the submariners found themselves in a dangerous situation when their vessel suddenly became entangled in the radio net, and as a result, they were pulled underwater as the submarine slowly sank to the bottom. The Fanning crew immediately began taking action, throwing ropes to the struggling group of German sailors, but their hands were numb from the cold water and could not hold the ropes tightly. Men who had previously survived depth charge explosions and gunfire now found themselves just a few meters from rescue, but in danger of drowning. At that moment, Senior Medic Eliezer Harville watched carefully as the men struggled in the water, and he also looked at Boatswain Francis J. Connor. There was no need for words in their expressions. Both men quickly took off their jackets and without hesitation, jumped into the icy Atlantic waters. The cold was so intense it felt as if someone had punched them in the chest. Bodies visibly tensed, and they gasped for air. But they did not stop and swam toward the nearest German sailors to help them. They secured ropes around their bodies so comrades could pull them aboard the ship. Gradually, one after another, 38 German sailors struggling for life were pulled from the water. The destroyer crew carefully wrapped them in warm blankets, offered hot coffee, and began providing first aid to the wounded. 2 of them were hopelessly injured, one of whom, Commander Franz Glindner, exhausted from the struggle to save his submarine, had managed to submerge before help could reach him. Another sailor, who had been rescued alive, unexpectedly lost consciousness right on the deck of the Fanning. His heart could not withstand the shock. The Lumis 58 submarine slowly and smoothly sank to the bottom. Its bow lifted and the stern began to flood. The rear propellers broke the water's surface for the last time, after which the vessel slid backward and disappeared into the depths of the ocean. The return journey to Queenstown was quiet and contemplative. The German prisoners, who were placed on the decks and in the ship's cabins, trembled from cold and shock. Some were still shivering, trying to warm up. The American sailors showed concern by bringing dry clothes and cigarettes to the prisoners to ease their condition at least a little. When the destroyer Fanning approached the quay in Queenstown, something unusual happened. As the German prisoners began to disembark, applause suddenly erupted. 38 voices, each expressing gratitude and respect, rose in 3 short ovations, a sudden and spontaneous display of appreciation from the prisoners to their rescuers, which surprised everyone present. Commander Amberger, despite the defeat, maintained his dignity and respectfully thanked Captain Carpenter for how his men were treated. He described this attitude as significantly better than expected. 2 days later, when it became clear that the work at sea was finished, Captain Carpenter once again set sail, but with a very sad task. The body of Commander Franz Glindner, carefully wrapped in cloth and with a weight on his legs, was laid on a board under the German national flag. The crew gathered on the deck, removing their hats despite the cold wind. The captain read the funeral service, and the former enemies stood frozen in place. At the end, the board with the body tilted, and Commander Glindner slowly slipped into the water, which he once knew so well and through which he had sailed. He was buried with honors that are usually granted to every sailor, regardless of which side he belonged to. When the ship returned to port, Vice Admiral himself appeared on board. The heroism of U-58 was no longer just an isolated victory. It became an important example of a tactical approach that confirmed the correctness of the new, more active method of conducting naval warfare for the Allies. This case became a starting point for revising the entire anti-submarine doctrine, and its consequences were felt literally within days after the battle's conclusion. Soon after, the command distributed reports prepared by officers Fanning and Nilsson across the fleet. These documents not only explained the course of the battle, but also radically changed the approach to countering enemy submarines, introducing new ideas and tactics that practically overnight formed the basis of a new strategy. Now the lookouts over the side were retrained to notice even the faintest signs of a submarine's presence. Not only large torpedo wake traces, but also the tiniest hints, such as barely noticeable splashes or faint periscope reflections. As part of this updated approach, depth charges began to be used systematically and with full commitment, turning into a constant and relentless threat to the enemies. This demonstrated that destroyers could not only calmly escort convoys as guardians, but also actively become hunters, transforming the enemy's hunting grounds, the zone where submarines hide, into a trap for themselves. This new offensive mindset, spreading throughout the convoy system across the Atlantic, yielded remarkable results. By the end of the 12th month of 1917, when nearly 9,000 ships were under escort, the loss rate per ship was less than 30%, significantly better than the figures for ships sailing alone, where the loss rate exceeded 7%. This meant that the Allies had found a way to combat the invisible hunters, German submarines, which previously seemed almost invincible. As a result, the German Imperial fleet found itself in a very difficult position. The hunter became the hunted, and their dangerous submarines began to suffer serious losses. In the 21st and 22nd centuries, the number of submarine losses increased to such an extent that maintaining their combat effectiveness became difficult. In 1917, 61 submarines were lost, and the following year, losses only increased, making it impossible to preserve elite crews. Reports from captured sailors and intelligence indicated a growing fear and declining morale among submarine crews. Initially, the strategy aimed at blockading and weakening Britain backfired on Germany itself. Its submarine fleet began to be exhausted and lose combat capability. This unexpected outcome was not only a disappointment, but also a serious lesson for German commanders. When single attacks failed to produce the desired results, they were forced to seek new solutions. Ultimately, the German command began experimenting with group tactics, which in later years became known as the Wolfpack strategy, a tactic developed during those years and only becoming a classic 2 decades later. As a result, the original plan to destroy British maritime supply lines with lone submarines proved ineffective, And the failures of these lone hunters prompted the formation of group units capable of attacking in large packs, significantly increasing the effectiveness of the German submarine fleet in subsequent years.